Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We want to give people a chance to jump on. But while we're waiting, if you want to go ahead and share with us what brought you to the webinar today, we would love to know what your relationship to rural grocery stores is. So feel free to share with us in the chat what brought you here today. Okay, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome to the second installment of our webinar series, Keeping Groceries Alive, Successful Ownership Transitions for Rural Grocery Stores. My name is Erica Blair. I'm a program manager with the Rural Grocery Initiative at Kansas State University. And we are so glad that you're joining us today. We know that when grocery stores create transition plans, they are much more likely to remain open and continue serving their communities long term. And we've learned that it's much harder to reopen a grocery store after it's already closed. So we want to see a smooth ownership transition as much as possible. So we want to thank our team of partners who created this webinar series. Each of these organizations has a unique set of expertise that has contributed to this series. And we also want to thank our sponsor, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, for making this project possible. And next slide, I have a few quick housekeeping items. So first, this webinar is being recorded, and you can find the recording at ruralgrocery.org under the events tab. If you have any technical questions, we have our students Lauren and Jess working behind the scenes to help you out. And finally, we will have time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. This just makes it easier for us to track your questions and make sure that we don't miss anything. And if somebody has already asked your question, you can just click the like button so that we know several people are wondering the same thing. You are still welcome to use the chat box to share your ideas and comments, but for specific questions to presenters, please use the Q&A box. So with that, we can go ahead and get started. We will begin with Stuart Reed with the Food Co-op Initiative, explaining why grocery ownership models are important considerations in rural communities. And then we'll walk through the characteristics of a few types of shared ownership models, including cooperatives. So Stuart, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Erica. We can go to the next slide right away. Happy to be here today with everybody to tell you a little bit about a couple of different models that are in use for grocery stores in rural America. But we'll start with just a basic question of why should you be even thinking about this? Well, basic and first of all is that the model that you've got right now isn't necessarily the right one for what you want to do in the future. You've got an opportunity here to do things differently. You can take advantage of real estate that either you have or could have. You can change what you're offering to the public, to the community, so that you can better meet their needs. And you have the opportunity to also potentially partner with other businesses to share a space and a retail environment. You'll see a lot of times in larger supermarkets where they will lease space out to a bank teller station, an eyewear station, you name it. And there's no reason that smaller businesses can't do that as well. So it's something that gives you an opportunity at least to think of these things. And finally, the really most important reason for thinking about different ownership models is to figure out what best fits your community and the needs of your community and the resources that you have to work with. And we will be talking about that more in an upcoming webinar, so we won't get into that too deeply today, but that's the outline basically of some of the things you should think about when you're considering ownership models. Okay, we can go to the next. So there may be other models than these. These are the ones that we're going to kind of talk about today. The independent operator model is very common for small rural communities, family-owned business or partnership perhaps, or just literally an independent single operator. And it's common. We pretty much know that one. Another model that exists in quite a few communities is the cooperative model of ownership. And I'll go into greater detail on what each of these models implies for how you organize, how it works, and what benefits might be. There are a limited number of true nonprofit grocery stores. It's not a common model because, frankly, the IRS doesn't think selling groceries is a charitable business, but there can be exceptions. And increasingly, we're seeing public-private partnerships. Again, we'll talk more about what that might look like in a little bit later. And some communities have actually municipally owned stores, just like commonly in the past we saw municipal liquor stores. There is no real reason why you couldn't have a municipal grocery store. And finally, an intriguing model that's in place in a couple communities we know of is a school-based grocery store, which is a combination of providing retail groceries and training for students. Finally, while we're not going to talk about it as an option today, we have to recognize, of course, the role that corporate chains play in rural America and the grocery world. They dominate. Clearly, they dominate. And as dollar stores are coming into so many more communities, they can be a threat to independent operators and other types of small businesses, while not necessarily providing the community with the full range of goods and services that they want. So we're looking at solutions here today that we think can best meet the needs of a community rather than the needs of some investors in a different place. Okay, we can go to the next. So a little bit to just get a sense of what your thinking is on we're talking about some community-owned stores and community partnerships. What does that mean to you? We've got a little poll we'd like you to fill out quickly, and we can go to that right away. Here you go. So just take a few seconds to click what you think of when you hear that term of community-owned grocery store. And we'll take a look at what kind of responses we're getting in just a little bit. That shouldn't take folks too long. It's a pretty simple and short poll. So I think we will give you about 5 more seconds and then close it and take a look at the results. Okay. And here we have it. Oh, well, all of the above is by far the most popular answer. It was 62% of you recognizing that there could be any number of different things. So second most common response was that there is a board made up of community members that lead the store. Uh, that can be the case. It isn't always, but community members shopping at the store, certainly I think that would be implied with almost any business model. And a local institution or government putting money into the formation of a store, that can also happen with most of the different models. So, and likewise, again, a local institution or government managing day-to-day operations, that's fairly rare. That would pretty much be a municipal owned store, which would be a type of community owned store. So I think that for the most part, all of the above covers a lot of the options, and that's pretty interesting that you've landed there. So, okay, thank you for that. We can move on. So let's start with the going through the different models that I listed before, with some of the thinking about why would you want to consider one or the other. And again, we're starting with probably the most common and well-known as independent operators, where one or two people or some small partnership of individuals has direct control of the property, the building, the business, and the inventory. It's pretty straightforward and uncomplicated, which is definitely one of the benefits. It's understood by people, and the community as a whole has a lesser role in making sure that the store can get opened, it can get capitalized, the money is there that's necessary to do improvements and things. The fact that the owners are going to benefit directly if there is a profit, if the store is successful, gives them a very strong personal interest in the outcome. And so that vested personal interest sometimes results in people working longer hours than they would if they were getting paid a salary or a wage by somebody else. And that is an interesting aspect of independent operators, and perhaps one of the reasons why we are seeing some of the stores being put on the market, a little bit of burnout happening or approaching retirement. It is the only real downside of an independent operator is, can you find someone who is willing to take over a store in a timely manner when the existing owners are ready to move on? Somebody that not only can afford it or can get the financing for it, but has the skill set and the connections to the community to make it successful. So it's very dependent on the operator for almost every aspect of that store's success. Next up. Here's an example of a fairly typical independent operator. It was a store that had closed. The store in town had closed in 2007. Local resident who was, I believe he was a welder at the time, was encouraged or prodded hard, had his arm twisted that he should consider opening a store in town. And apparently he took up that mantle, and he and his family literally built the store over the next year during their somewhat spare time as they continued to work on their other jobs. And it's very much a family business. It opened for business opened the doors in 2008. And the owners continued to work at their regular jobs for 3.5 years before they could step away and make it on just the income from the grocery store. So it's not necessarily an easy and quick transition for somebody. This could be a little easier in the case of a store that hasn't closed yet, where you can take over the operations. In this case, they were rebuilding pretty much from the ground up. Clint now jokes that after they finally got to just working at the grocery store, he only has to work 6 half days a week. A half day, of course, is 12 hours. Next slide. Okay, so the next one I'm going to talk about, and it's my own area of greatest interest. I work for an organization that helps support the development of food co-ops What do you know about them? How much do you know? So we've got a quick little poll here because we recognize that not everyone is that familiar. And here you are again. Just take a few seconds to click what is appropriate answer for you. If you are a Kansas resident, there are not a whole lot of food co-ops to be found in the state at this time, although there are a couple, and one at least in Lawrence, Kansas, that's been there for over 40 years. So they do have a history as well. All right, that's a fairly short quiz. Let's see what we got. Okay, so about 50-50 between people that have never been in a co-op and people that have shopped in one. That's very interesting. There's less than a fourth of you are an actual owner member of a co-op, and that's gratifying that it's that high even. And a few of you that have even been on the board of directors of the food co-op. Okay, well, that's great. We'll talk a little bit about what exactly a food co-op is, because while a lot of people are familiar with other kinds of co-ops, like the ag co-ops, maybe the utility co-ops, the electric co-ops, you might even know that credit unions are a type of co-op. Food co-ops are not as ubiquitous, so there tend to be an educational process necessary in the community to help people understand exactly what we're talking about here. We can go to the next slide. So this is a model that is truly community owned, but it's not necessarily everyone in the community. A municipally owned store would, if the city owns it, then it's on behalf of all of the people that reside there. A cooperative operates for the benefit of the whole community, but people have a choice whether they want to be a part of it or not. And that ownership comes in the share way of buying an owner share, or a membership, as it's typically just called. Individuals can invest a relatively modest amount of money. Typically, it's between $100 and $300 to buy their ownership share. And a lot of people in the community buying those means that each one of those people technically has a small share of that business that they own and they control together. So that it's a democratic form of ownership where every shareholder has one vote. It's not determined by how many shares you own, because you can only own one voting share. So it's very democratically controlled. Co-ops, because they are owned by the people in the community and are governed by the people in the community, are very responsive to the community. They know what they need. They know what the co-op can provide for them. And that becomes the mission of the co-op. It becomes its marketing plan, if you will. Its product, services, business plan is all based on what do we in the community need from this business, not what it's, and that wealth, it keeps wealth in the community in a variety of ways. One, the jobs are almost all local. There isn't a corporate headquarters in Detroit or in Delaware where all of the executives work. All of the people in the store, like a regular or traditional independently owned store, they're local, and the money stays in the community. They also often are very supportive of local farmers, businesses, and service providers. So again, they are keeping money in the community rather than buying everything through a national distributor. They're trying to help other people in the community to grow their own businesses and survive. They are committed to education. It's one of the international principles of cooperatives, is that they provide education to their members and their community. That can come in the form of cooking classes or canning classes or gardening classes, or it could be in the form of other kinds of workshops and community outreach. But that community engagement, which is often a hallmark of small rural grocery stores of any kind, is a built-in principle for food co-ops. And one of the benefits that you gain with a cooperative is that while it's an independently owned business by the people in the community, a group of people owning it, It's part of a network of other food co-ops in the country, and co-ops support each other. They don't see each other as competitors. They will share a lot of information, knowledge. In fact, if you at a certain size of store, you can join a national association that provides purchasing contracts and all kinds of other support. So there's a whole system of support available to food co-ops. They aren't working in a vacuum. And it's important to realize too that they're not charities. They are for-profit businesses. The profits of the business go back to those people that joined the co-op. When it's profitable, they get a share of the surplus based on how much they've spent at the store during the given year. Not again, not based on investment, but on how much they use the services of the business. So that's the business model. And other than the way it's structured for control and investment and things like that, you walk into a food co-op and it's not going to look very different from any other store. There's nothing that says a food co-op sells only organic food or that it has to sell any kind of food. It can be whatever you as a community want it to be. And that's also one of the wonderful benefits. So each store is unique, but because it's owned by the people that shop there, you can have a more responsive kind of a business. I hope my my personal feelings about co-ops are showing through a little bit there. I do tend to glow. All right, let's look at the next slide. This is an example of a co-op in Kansas. I think it's the most recent one to have opened. The Morrison Market in Moran, Kansas. You can see barely in the little picture on the upper left in the background, there's a Stubbs sign. It was the previous owner before the co-op bought the building and the business. And if you go to the next slide. Oops, there you go. So this is their story. This was a case where the owner wanted to sell out. They had a couple of different stores in a couple of different towns. This one they wanted to close, and they were trying to find a buyer for some time, and it was getting close to the point where they were maybe going to walk away. The community wanted to keep the store, and there's a community development group in Allen County called Thrive Allen County that decided to take on this project. And they had a Vista volunteer on staff at the time that took on the project manager role for this project, which was hugely helpful because it meant that there was a paid person committed to working on the whole transition and keeping everything moving forward. They interacted with us at Food Co-op Initiative quite a bit to get advice and guidance on forming a cooperative. And that's the first step, aside from just determining that there was interest in the community. They incorporated as a co-op and began signing up owners, people that would invest a little money in the project. Our organization provided some seed grant funding, and that helped them with some of their initial expenses in getting going. And after they'd built up enough owners and capital and were able to raise the rest of the capital they needed to buy the business, they, as they were approaching that, they were fortunate. They were able to hire a grocery co-op manager, somebody with past experience in another food co-op, somebody that not only understood the business model, but also the grocery business. And that was a big, big plus. So a little over a year after they started in really putting the pedal to the metal on this project, they bought the business, acquired it on May 30th, and they never even closed the doors to make the transition. They kept running continuously. Which was challenging because they really wanted to do some improvements and the store needed a good thorough cleaning, and they made all that happen, and even went through some unexpected equipment failures because the old equipment from the business hadn't really been maintained very well. So, but they're alive and well today, and if you're ever in Moran, Kansas, I encourage you to stop by. Okay, next. And finally, I'm just mentioning nonprofit here. It is possible, but it's very rare that you see a nonprofit, true nonprofit, grocery store. Because the IRS will only recognize for a nonprofit, charitable nonprofit, if you have a charitable mission. Selling groceries is not a charitable mission. Providing food access in an area where there otherwise would not be any can be defined as a charitable mission if you are successful in convincing them and setting up your organization correctly. So again, it's not often an option, but if it is an option, there are some good benefits. For example, a nonprofit sponsoring organization in the community can take the co-op, not the co-op, excuse me, the grocery store under its wings, and provide support both in terms of organizing, training, even capital, because it can come in through charitable donations in a case like that. And in the long run, if necessary, there's potential to even use charitable contributions to subsidize what might otherwise not be a profitable operation. And that's not possible in any other business model, obviously. So that I think is all I have for you. And go to the next slide. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Rael now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart. So I'm going to take it from here and share a little bit about, share a few examples and a few more ownership models. And I just wanted to kind of follow up with what Stuart was saying and share that we've looked at in this webinar series, we've already looked at one nonprofit example, and that was, so a nonprofit example, which was the Moreland Mercantile. And another example that I want to highlight is the Grand Avenue Market in Plains, Kansas. And Plains is located in the southwest part of the state with a population of about 1,100 people. And the story of this Grand Avenue Market opening is one of persistence. So the community of Plains lost their grocery store in 2001. In 2008, a group of community members came together to think about what action they could take to reopen that store. And they've really been working on it ever since. As you can see in the timeline on the slide, they've been working on it ever since. And in 2008, the city council appointed a group of community members to steer the grocery store reopening process. And for the first few years, they spent quite a bit of time information gathering. And one of the ways they did that was by visiting stores, including the Moreland Mercantile. In 2012, the Community Enhancement Foundation of Plains was officially formed as a 501c3. And so in this example, the way that the nonprofit grocery model came to be is through using the 501c3 sort of status. I see that there was a comment on that distinction, and I just want to point out that that's kind of the route that this community took. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So since 2012, they've done quite a bit of work. The organization has. They've spearheaded the fundraising efforts. They've applied for and received several different grants. And they've also conducted market research to ensure that a new grocery store would be a fit in the community. So the Grand Avenue Market is not yet open. It's still in development. They hope to break ground later this month, hopefully, and then also hope to open later this year. But the reason I wanted to highlight this example is because it really shows how a nonprofit model can make sense for a community. It's an opportunity for community members or a local organization to step in and work for the betterment of their community. And it also keeps the community that the store is serving at the core of its mission. So you can see in this timeline that the community input and involvement have been at the core of this project. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about another ownership model, which is the public-private partnership model. And the essence of this model is that you are sharing ownership of a grocery store, in this case, among at least two different entities. The entities tend to be a public entity and a private entity. The public entity could be a municipal government, it could be a city or county government, it could be a school district or a community foundation. And then the private entity tends to be your independent business owner. And this concept really plays to the strengths that each of these entities bring to the table. So a municipality owning land or property is not necessarily a new concept. And often in this case, the public entity would own the building, the property, and then lease that to the business. And then the private entity in this partnership would own the business entity and the inventory in the building. And this arrangement can also allow for some flexibility in the terms that are set forth. It can mean that maybe the local government provides a lower than market rate rent for the first few years as the grocery business is getting their feet under them, and then gradually sort of increase that. Through this partnership, you have a little more flexibility there to implement those sorts of differences. So there are a couple reasons why you might want to consider this model. One reason is that a shared ownership model like this means you have double the access to a variety of financial resources. For instance, the public sector, the local government may have access to a totally different category of funds than the independent business owner would have access to. And so this means you can kind of accomplish different things through that type of access. Additionally, when the public entity invests in a grocery store, it's investing in access to healthy food for their community, and it can help ensure that community residents see that amenity as a priority, and it helps to maintain the appeal for existing community members and prospective community members because that key amenity is there. And then lastly, this model can facilitate a less burdensome transition. It can mean that the city is involved and engaged in the transition and can help the owner identify or can help the business owner identify a new manager, or can help consider their options in order to develop a business transition plan. So I'd like to share an example of a public-private partnership, and that would be the Garden of Eden grocery store in Little River, Kansas, which is a city of about 600 people. When David and Deborah Nelson, who you can see here on the right, when they took over ownership of the store in 2005, the building was at least 100 years old, and many of the appliances in the building were many decades old. I think about 50 years old was the average. So the Nelsons really had an uphill battle of trying to upgrade the building and the appliances in the building while also trying to make a profit. And a local banker heard of this challenge and came up with an idea, which ended up being a public-private partnership, where the city would purchase the building and its fixtures, including the appliances, some of the in-store appliances, and then have the Nelsons lease back to the city. And so this meant the responsibility for maintaining the building, for maintaining the coolers and freezers, were the responsibility of the city. And when this transition happened, the city immediately applied for funding to a local community foundation and received a grant to support renovation costs for new coolers, freezers, ceiling and facade improvements. And the renovations themselves were able to drop the store's energy bills by half. So when the Nelsons are ready to retire, they're not there yet, but when they're ready to retire, they'll be able to work with the city to recruit a new manager. And by sharing the ownership of the store, it will be much less of a burden for a new manager or business owner to come in, because the purchases that business owner will need to make will simply be the inventory of the store rather than purchasing the inventory and the property and the building. So that's one key benefit also of this model, is that it facilitates transitions in order to kind of ease the burden among multiple entities. So we'll shift to another model, which we call the municipality-owned model. And this may sound familiar. We talked with a municipality-owned model last week when we talked with the Erie Market during our first webinar of this series. And in the municipality-owned model, it's the primary player is the municipal entity. So it could be, again, it could be a city or a county government. And the concept of this model is really not far from a city utility, like a city-owned water department or even an electric utility. And so in this case, the municipality would own kind of all of the aspects of the business. They'd own the property, the building, the business, and the inventory. And in an example I'm going to show in a few minutes, the mayor of the city with a municipality-owned store was quoted saying that the city owned the water department to furnish water for the citizens of the community. Why could we not own our grocery store to furnish food for the citizens of the community? So that's really the perspective that brings people to this model. This model puts a grocery store and its importance to the community squarely in the realm of a public good that is being provided by the municipality. So because in this model, the operation of the store tends to be supported by local tax dollars, when this model is being established, it often requires input from community residents. And we saw last week with Erie Market that they did that through a survey that was sent to every resident in the community. Another way to do this would be to have a question listed on the ballot, so folks are actually voting to show their feedback on the concept of a municipality-owned store. Similar to the public-private partnership model, the benefit of a municipality-owned store is that you have long-term buy-in into a grocery store in your community. But a key benefit here with the municipality-owned is that the grocery store owners or the grocery store employees are considered municipal employees and therefore receive benefits like retirement and health insurance. And this can really help with attracting new employees. It can help with retaining existing employees. It also can be a way to attract a new general manager during a transition, since this type of benefit is really not commonly offered by rural grocery stores. And then lastly, a unique characteristic of the municipality-owned model is that there's less pressure to turn a profit. So the focus really is simply on covering the operating expenses of the store. So I'm going to share an example, the St. Paul Market, which is actually situated just 10 miles east of Erie Market, the example we talked about last week. St. Paul is a town of about 700 residents. And in 1985, the longstanding grocery store closed its doors. After about 20 years later, the local school district closed, and this really caused the community to jump into action and consider their options. And so after a series of conversations, there were two kind of key action items that they decided on to move forward. One was to work to reopen the school, which they eventually did, and then the other was to build a grocery store. And so in 2005, the mayor in that city and a group of concerned citizens who called themselves the St. Paul Community Development Corporation decided to pursue funding through the USDA Rural Development's Rural Economic Development Loan and Grant Program, often referred to as the Red Leg Program. And the Red Leg Program relies on a rural electric cooperative. And in this case, the Heartland Rural Electric received the loan from USDA Rural Development and then administered the zero interest loan to the applicant, St. Paul. So one requirement of this type of loan is that the loan be guaranteed by a third party. And you might first turn to a local bank to guarantee this type of loan, but instead the city offered to guarantee the loan. But for that to work, the St. Paul residents needed to vote on it. So there was a vote. So the question was put to vote, and the city unanimously passed or overwhelmingly passed that issue and supported the city guaranteeing the loans, which basically meant that if the entity that owned the store defaulted on the loan, the city would be on the hook for covering that cost. So the St. Paul market opened in 2008. And at that time, there were 3 funding partners. So there was the public dollars that came in from the city of St. Paul that bought the property and built the physical store. And then the St. Paul Community Development Corporation that invested some of their own money to get the business up and running. And then a husband and wife team that purchased the inventory and managed the store. And so the St. Paul market operated in that way for several years. At that time, it'd be considered a public-private partnership. But by 2013, when the managers wanted to retire, the St. Paul City Commission decided to assume operation of the store. And so they bought out the shares from the Community Development Corporation and the couple that was managing the store, hired a new couple, and they've been running that store as a municipality-owned business since. So the employees at this store are city employees. They have city benefits. And the city also approves the annual budget for that grocery store to support the operation of the store. So the last example that I'm going to talk about is the school-owned store. And in many ways, this looks similar to a municipality-owned store. It is owned by a public entity, a school district, and the school district would own kind of every aspect of the store, the property, the building, the business, and the inventory. Additionally, the focus on supporting their costs would be the focus rather than a focus on making a profit. They just want to make sure they're covering their costs. The key difference here is that the school-owned store has a clear educational mission, and they have students that are involved in the operation of the store, whether that's through a defined class like a business or an entrepreneurial class, or in another way. And the students also make up a willing and able workforce to assist in running the store. So another key benefit of a school-owned store is that, and this especially in a rural community, is that it secures the school as a member in the community. And for residents that may not have school-aged children, it can provide a touch point for those community members to interact with the school and its students. So the example that I want to share here is the Bluestem Mercantile in Leon, Kansas. And Leon is in the south central part of the state, about 30 miles east of Wichita. Over the past 10 years, the Bluestem High School has offered an entrepreneurial class. And the class has focused on different types of businesses, from selling candy to operating a coffee shop in their school library. The students in that entrepreneurship class learn about business planning and operations and learn practical hands-on business experience. After the school opened the coffee shop in the library, the district superintendent had his sights on opening a business in downtown Leon. He'd had this idea in the back of his mind for many years, but wasn't sure exactly what kind of business it would be or how that would come to fruition. So when in 2019, the old grocery store building was for sale, the superintendent saw an opportunity and approached the school board about purchasing the building. So over the years, that school board for the Bluestem School District had assisted in a few projects like this. For example, when the school's agriculture program wanted to build a barn to expand its agricultural education offerings, the school district approved the purchase of the building or the cost for building that barn, and then expected that the agricultural education program, would handle the operations and cover the costs. And this was followed with this decision with the school board, when the school board passed a motion for any cost over $20,000. That's what was required. And the school board approved the purchase of the building for $27,500. And so the expectation in this example was that the grocery store would cover the cost to operate the store. So the school board simply paid for that initial cost of the building, and then the operation of the grocery store was expected to cover the operational costs. So the decision to open a grocery store rather than some other type of business in the community really came from seeing a need in the community. So at that time, the local community in Leon did not have a grocery store, and the nearest stores were at least 15 miles away. So in this community, the grocery store offers the essentials. It's not necessarily a full service supermarket like you might see in a bigger town, but it offers the essentials that you can come into the store and hopefully get enough to make a meal. And so since the store's primary focus in this example is on providing educational opportunities for its students, the store really acts like a classroom. There are classes taught in the store 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. The seating area shown here on the left includes tables that were built by the shop class at the school, and it's used for some of the classes that are hosted there. So the Mercantile is supported by the entire Bluestem School District, and the entrepreneurship students assist in operating the store. The special ed students are gaining practical life skills. The agricultural students at the high school are supplying meat and eggs to the grocery store, and other clubs and classes have crafted products that can also be sold at the store. So when the Mercantile opened this past year, March 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, it really became a lifetime for the community and a lifeline for the community. And local residents preferred visiting the Mercantile instead of traveling to larger stores in communities further away. And so this really ended up being a key amenity in the town of Leon. So those are all the examples that we're going to go through. And in many cases, what we see is that the default for grocery businesses that are in transition is to follow the same ownership model that was in place before. And what we've seen is that this can really be an opportunity to reimagine that role and reimagine the role the grocery store plays in the community and who the key players are in that community. So with that, we're going to ask one last question, and then we're going to get to some Q&A. And so we'll launch this poll and ask, after hearing this presentation, what model are you most interested in pursuing or learning more about? Okay, we'll give it a couple more minutes. It seems like, from what I can see so far, it seems like it's fairly evenly distributed. We'll give it a couple more seconds here and then close it. All right, let's go ahead and share our results. Okay, so it looks like the municipality owned had the highest votes, but really this is very well split. So this is good to see. Lots of interest in a lot of different ways. And I think that really fits what we are trying to share, is that each community is really important in this decision. And so it depends on the culture of your community. So let's go on to the next slide here. And I'm just going to briefly touch on a few resources. So the Rural Grocery Toolkit is a really helpful resource for communities working on business transitions and opening new grocery stores. The Food Co-op Initiative also has a resource page. We can go to the next slide. So I invite you to check out that website with many resources specific to cooperative groceries. And lastly, I just want to point out a few specific resources on the next slide that, first of all, a couple of the examples that we shared today have been written about in some rural grocery success stories. So we will post that with the recording and Q&A summary after this webinar. We also have a couple other guides that can be really important as you're considering these different options and then getting started with some of the key steps towards opening a business. So with that, we've got just 10 minutes here, and we're going to shift gears to Q&A and try to give you all have a chance to answer some of these questions. Erica is going to come back on the line, and we will respond to some of your questions.
Yeah, we have received a couple of questions in the Q&A box, but if folks still have questions, just keep putting them in the Q&A box here. But we have a couple of people wondering, what is the average cost of purchasing an existing grocery store? Understanding that they will all be different depending on how successful the store is already. So they're just kind of looking for a ballpark number.
I will just say that I can share a little bit on kind of the categories of costs that you might be looking at for a grocery store. And it sort of reflects what I shared in the presentation, is that some of the key costs that you're going to encounter will be the property and the actual building cost. And then the if you're purchasing the business name and from the previous owner, and then also the inventory cost. And so those are all sort of different types of cost. There is, I think that if you're purchasing a business, it generally can be a percentage of that business's sales. And then the inventory has sort of a general per square foot cost that we could get you, that we could post with our Q&A summary after this. I don't have it off the top of my head. Stuart, do you have anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, it's incredibly variable. And as a potential buyer, you have to look at the quality of the building, the quality of the equipment and fixtures, how much of it's going to have to be replaced soon, or even should be replaced just for energy efficiency. And the inventory, you have to assume that a fair percentage of it won't be saleable. And so you're not going to want to pay the book value for that in most cases. So yeah, there's a lot of things that go into it. And certainly it's largely proportional to the size of the store itself if everything else is equal. So, it's per square foot is a way we often benchmark costs. But especially when you're acquiring an existing business, you've really got to look at the details of everything that you're getting and evaluate those things separately. So it's hard to give you a number of what's typical, because a typical store that hasn't been maintained might not be worth everything included more than $40,000 or even less. And a well-maintained, slightly larger store could be, 300,000 or 400,000 maybe. So.
All right, and we have a couple of questions on the city-owned grocery ownership model. So on city-owned stores, what is the city funding source?
So what I know is that the city incorporates the grocery store into their city budget. And so it would be approved on an annual basis. And the specific source, I think, would depend on each city. I know that for an example, with, I guess, Erie, that we talked about last week, was that the economic development group was involved in reviewing some of the financials. And so really in the end, the budget was based off of what data they had from the previous owners. And then the city was able to kind of establish a budget based on that. So in terms of where it fits in the actual budget of the city, I don't know for sure. I think that's something we can try to reach out and ask more specifically about from each of these, of what line item that would look like. I also saw a question about sales tax, and I think that that's a tool that can be used to for this type of model, and that can be something that could be incorporated into a vote or a survey depending on the logistics, in order to get approval from the city, or from city residents.
City could use any of the same tools it uses for any other major acquisition, essentially. Issuing treasury bonds, for example, if they needed to raise a significant amount of money to acquire the business to begin with.
All right, we have another question here. Have you seen success with rural grocery stores that use or purchase local or hyper-local food products?
Yes.
Yes.
A lot of food co-ops emphasize that, as I mentioned when I was giving my part of the presentation. And you're not going to be able to do 100%. Obviously, we don't raise everything that people need in any part of this country. Coffee, for example, and chocolate. You got to have those on the shelf. But yeah, stores that have good sources of supply nearby often will buy directly from farmers, and it can be very successful because you can build that community relationship. You know the people whose food you're eating, and people like that a lot. And a lot of times the quality is very good.
Yep, and I would say the example in Leon really focuses on local products. I also think for some of the really small stores that can't achieve some of the minimum buying requirements, they are sort of forced to look closer to home. And so some of the ways those stores sort of fill the gap is by working with local producers and shifting their focus to the local economy rather than the larger wholesale economy.
And so we have time for probably just one more question, but I was wondering if you could touch on what can current owners do to ensure a smooth and successful transition of ownership?
From my perspective, the number one thing is to be supportive of whoever it is that's trying to make the acquisition and to be patient. It always seems to take longer than you would like. And if you're planning ahead far enough, that you can have your plans outlined before the last minute when I want to retire and I don't want to wait 6 months. It's going to be a lot harder than I'm going to retire in 2 years. Let's start thinking about how that's going to look.
Yep, and I would just say attend next week's webinar. That's a perfect segue, is that we'll be talking about how to prepare for a business transition and really be diving into this. And I think Stuart's comments are important. And I think some of the logistical challenges that we'll talk through next week in terms of getting your plan in place are especially important for a transition.
I did see a question, if I could just throw this in real quick, about whether there are programs to upgrade equipment for higher efficiency. And the USDA does have programs for energy efficiency in business replacements. So you'd have to check with your regional USDA office in any given year to find out how much funding is available and what the requirements are. But they've had some good programs for that.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Stuart and Ryle, for your presentations. And if you asked a question and we didn't get to it in the Q&A, just check back at our website, ruralgrocery.org, and we'll try to answer those questions and post those answers on the website for you. So as we wrap up, we just want to remind you that all of our upcoming webinars will be held on Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Central. As you can see, we have a lot of great topics coming up, and you can see the full schedule there at ruralgrocery.org. And next slide. So the webinar that we will be presenting next week is all about preparing for business transition. And we have Jack Harwell and John Adesi with the Kansas Small Business Development Center and the Kansas Center for Business Transition, who will be covering key concepts in developing a business transition plan. So things like, how long does this take and who should be involved? How do you estimate the value of a store? Lots of important considerations like that and best practices. So we hope you can join us for that. And we just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you have a better understanding of different ownership models, and we hope to see you next week. Thanks.